Yes? Hey everyone, Glenn Greenwald back with a special edition of System Update here on our home on Rumble. And I say it's a special edition because I'm going to be joined in just a minute by someone who answered a public call that I put out for critics of mine to step forward by leaving the kind of cauldron of Twitter that is not very conducive to constructive discourse and to talk to me about the criticisms that they have about my work and about some of the things I've been doing of late, and just to kind of give a little bit of a uh, context for what has led us here. About 2 weeks ago now, I think on November 14th, I put out a series of tweets. And one was in response to one by Caitlin Johnstone, who's a commentator from Australia, who had tweeted, "If you think Glenn Greenwald is a right winger or Joe Rogan is a fascist, it's because you've disappeared as far into your own ideological anus as possible as the people who think Biden is a Marxist. You can disagree with someone without making them the extreme opposite of everything you value." And that really resonated to me, the idea that oftentimes it seems like I'm in search of critics who don't just criticize what I'm saying, but go to the opposite direction of claiming I'm some kind of a fascist or white nationalist. And so in response, I wrote, social media most rewards enemies list and binaries. Hence, there are only two categories. One, ratify every last liberal orthodoxy, or two, show you're a far right white nationalist fascist. Labels are pointless, but I would love to talk to someone who disagrees with this, pointing to Caitlin's tweet. And the example I had cited at the time seems a little trivial, but just to illustrate the point that I was getting at in trying to take these discussions out of Twitter, was that the liberal YouTuber Sam Cedar had gone onto Twitter and had accused Jimmy Dore, the YouTube host, of something quite grave. Jimmy Dore had, during one of his shows, presented a quote that ended up being kind of a mangled distortion of the original, and he acknowledged the mistake, and he went back on the air and he explained that it happened because a producer of his had mistakenly joined together two different passages. He blamed the producer and announced that he was firing the producer as a result of that mistake. And you can certainly debate whether that was the right way to handle that. I personally think it's fine to explain what happened, but ultimately you're the one responsible for mistakes made on your show, on what it is that you present. But the critique that Sam Cedar made of Jimmy Dore wasn't that he handled it the wrong way. He accused him of lying about the entire thing, of fabricating the existence of a fictitious producer, and said, "I bet you any amount of money there is no producer. Jimmy fabricated this. This whole thing is a made up story." Since I knew for certain who the producer was and I knew for certain exactly what happened, I said to Sam, "I'm willing to bet, because I know that what you're accusing Jimmy of is false." Sam ignored me, ignored that challenge. A bunch of his followers and fans kind of made something out of it by turning it into something completely different. And that was when I realized, look, you can't even provide any accountability to anyone on Twitter. It's so easy to distort and run away from and evade what you've said. I've always found talking to critics to be a crucial form of journalistic accountability, going back all the way to the days when I had a blog in 2005. I would go into my comments section, engage with people who were supportive of my work, who were critical of my work. I've always considered it a huge value. And so I see a lot of critiques on Twitter about people claiming that I've changed my perspective or my outlook or my ideology, making claims about my motives. And so I said, if you're one of those people who shares in any of those critiques, please contact me by email so that we can actually have a substantive examination of these critiques to determine if there's validity to them, rather than just hurling kind of flyby insults back and forth on Twitter. Several people responded and emailed me, and I've scheduled talks with all of them to put here on Rumble. And I think the first person who contacted me, or certainly one of the first, is the person I'm about to introduce. His name is Stephen Fritz, who explained to me that he does have several what he regards as serious criticisms of my work and of my perspective and ideology and motives. And so we scheduled a time for today to discuss those. So let me welcome Stephen Fritz to the show. And first of all, thank you for taking your time to volunteer to express these criticisms. I know that's not necessarily an easy thing for anybody to do. You're using your valuable time in order to do it, which I really appreciate. So I want to turn over the floor to you to introduce yourself, as much as you want to say about who you are and what you do, and then go ahead and, a kind of summary way, outline the critique or critiques that you have of me, and then we can kind of take them one by one and try and discuss them in as, civil a manner as possible.
Well, I first off, I really appreciate you having me on. It's a very it's very humbling to be on the same call with a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist with 1.6 million followers on Twitter and global recognition. Um, I'm basically a nobody. This is a part time thing I do on YouTube. I got interested in politics because of Bernie Sanders, his first presidential run, and I've basically been following politics ever since. My ideology has shifted over time. I enjoy good debate and discussion because I couldn't agree more. Twitter is a cesspool. You can't get there's nothing productive that goes on there. Um, I guess we could start off with the initial email that I sent you, basically going over just a summarization of just a couple criticisms I have. I sent you this saying, "Hello, Glenn. My name is Steven, and this is regards to people challenging you on Twitter. The last couple of years have demonstrated how you don't criticize the conservative right or fascism in general anymore. You consider yourself a progressive, but it seems like most of your content is directed at their failings and how they negative affect U.S. politics. You consider yourself left, yet would never dare call out Tucker Carlson when invited on. You've called him a socialist for crying out loud. You play into anti-trans rhetoric perpetuated by right-wing reactionaries, and this isn't the only culture war issue you play up to cater to your growing reactionary fan base. And I believe this is intentional on your part, as reactionary people are a reliable demographic that will constantly tune into drama and consistently reinforce the fear-mongering rhetoric they hear from channels like yours. You have given credence to these irrelevant distractions perpetuated by right wing media as global fascism masquerading as conservatism and nationalism rises. I'd love to chat about this sometime on the show, and you're welcome on the channel anytime. And yeah, that's basically why I'm here.
Yeah, so that's one of the reasons why I responded. I feel like that's a pretty representative set of critiques,
Hmm.
the most common ones I hear, especially from people on the left. So I'm happy to respond to that in a summary way. But if you want to elaborate on some of those, you should feel free to take a few minutes to do that, or I'm happy to kind of give you my thoughts on what you laid out in the email.
Well, what was your I guess I would ask, what would be your initial reaction to just the email itself?
Well, so first of all, there's the premise embedded in your email, which is that I call myself or I insist upon the label of being on the left or progressive. And actually, I've really always tried hard from the time that I first wrote about politics, never to claim any of those labels,
Right.
not leftist or progressive, because I so often feel like they're more distracting and obfuscating than illuminating, in part
Completely
because,
understandable.
people have very different ideas of what they mean. So they're often terms that don't really explain much. They can create a lot of confusion, but also because I just feel like they're distracting.
Yeah,
I try and say what I think, and wherever those labels fall for other people, I'm more than happy to have them fall. I think, the only one I've ever kind of claimed or said I feel comfortable with is civil libertarian, kind of the old school ACLU
right.
view of civil liberties. And beyond that, I haven't really tried to place labels on myself. So let me just address a few of the kind of let me just group them together. The idea that I think there's probably two major critiques that you've outlined. One, that I don't criticize Republicans or fascism or Tucker Carlson
Yeah, the
simply
conservative
because I'm afraid of
conservative right in general.
alienating a conservative audience. I think
Right,
is the idea. And then the
right.
other one being that I focus a lot on kind of trivial culture war debates that come from the Republican Party. So I'll just give you
Sure.
my views on that. I mean, I have, a series of tweets, like a mountain of tweets,
Yes.
that I could go through, and I'm going to just do it really quickly, where I very vocally and emphatically criticize Republicans, people on the right. In 2019, I said drone strikes under Trump have caused far more terrorism than they've eliminated. I've defended Ilhan Omar as recently as last week, reminding people that she's one of the only people in the Democratic Party stepping up courageously to
Yes.
oppose a new war on terror. When the Congress voted to give $1 billion more or to Israel for the Iron Dome funding, I said I still don't understand how Republicans can simultaneously claim to believe in an American first foreign policy while transferring $1 billion to this foreign country that has better healthcare and education than many Americans. Um, I've criticized Jim Jordan, one of the most important kind of pro-Trump House members, as
Yeah.
recently as June, for being a fraud, for going on Fox News and railing against big tech, but then blocking actual reform of big tech and refusing to work with President Biden's chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission, Lena Khan, to break up big tech on antitrust grounds. When Trump left the White House on January 20th without declassifying all the documents he said, without pardoning Assange or Snowden, I wrote, quote, Trump left the White House about as weak, cocked, and submissive as it's possible for a
Mm-hmm.
grown adult to scamper away. I just last week said that the Republican attack on President Biden's nominee to be the head of a foreign trade commission was pathetic because they were trying to imply she was a communist for growing up in the Soviet Union. So it's just
Yeah.
constantly attacking the Republicans and the right. Um, and we can talk about Tucker Carlson specifically in a minute, but I just want to make clear.
Sure.
I mean, I'm doing that all the time. Like, these are not tweets from like 8 years ago. These are all from the last 2 or 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
And then as far as culture war, it's kind of like the idea that I'm always focused on the culture war. That to me is a little bit like these labels. Like, I'm never really sure what people mean by culture war.
Right.
If you go and look at the places where I do journalism, like Substack is where I write my articles, Rumble is where I do video reports.
Mm-hmm.
I have a regular column at Carta Capital, which is a news weekly in Brazil that I don't expect you to, be aware of because it's in Portuguese. That would be reasonable.
Right.
But in general, that's where I feel like I do journalism. The overwhelming bulk of my focus and what I write about is the same as it's ever been: civil liberties, free speech, the lives of the security state. Almost never am I writing about at least what I've kind of considered culture war issues like abortion or LGBT issues
Right.
or I don't know, so I never really understand where that critique comes from because I don't really feel like the focal point of my journalism has changed as compared to 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I feel like it stayed very consistent.
Okay. Well, a few things. A few things I want to touch on. When it comes to LGBT issues and trans representation, uh, you spoke with Katie Herzog on this, and you made a claim that there are concrete benefits to being trans and identifying as trans. Could you describe them?
Yeah. So I think this is the only time I actually wrote about trans issues
Mm-hmm.
in my life. And it was because I had posted a few things on Twitter.
Right.
I trended. I felt like people had misrepresented what I said. So I did a podcast with Katie Herzog,
Mm-hmm.
who's a lesbian and whose writing I really respect, who writes a lot about trans issues. She has a popular podcast.
Right.
And we talked about the fact that similar to the way that there's a lot of benefits for white people in academia to pretend that they're people of color, and there's been all kinds of cases where people get caught doing that. There's benefits in terms of affirmative action, in terms of quotas, in terms of positions, in terms of efforts to diversify, in terms of the idea that only people of color have the right to be heard on certain issues in elite discourse. I think the same is true of identifying as trans. There's a huge, explosion of
Mm-hmm.
people identifying as trans. Obviously, there are a lot of sectors in society where being trans is an enormous disadvantage, where there's
Right.
huge amounts of discrimination and bigotry. But what we were talking about is the idea that in elite discourse these days, in very similar ways that being marginalized kind of confers points. Like, people talk about the oppression Olympics. Like, it's always good to have more points in the oppression
Oh
Olympics.
yeah.
That being trans has become an advantage in left liberal circles because you're more likely to get certain jobs, you're more likely to be deferred to. There's the idea that you are uniquely discriminated against. I don't think it's a very uncommon point to make about how left liberal culture values marginalized identities.
Right. I mean, there's still debate going on online on whether or not trans people even exist. I think that kind of says everything when it comes to the way that trans people are represented and treated in
What do you mean
society.
by that? Where do you see that? What do you mean by whether they
Oh,
exist?
um, people that think that trans men are actually women and trans women are actually men, basically invalidating their identity. That's pretty common, especially when, among the conservative right. Like that kind of bigotry is actually fairly common.
Yeah, for sure. Like, I mean, I don't know how, I mean, we could probably debate how common it is. I think most mainstream conservatives, for example, don't misgender people. Some
Sure.
do. The main one's trying to be provocative.
Yeah.
Um, I don't, I look, there, first of all, and again, as far as the critique as that applies to me is concerned, I think literally in 10 years, that was the one time I wrote about trans
Sure.
issues. I
Okay.
think I wrote one other time about when Amazon had censored Abigail Shire's controversial book on kids and trans culture, but I didn't write about the merits of the book, which I only had read part of. I wrote about the dangers of that book being censored and the fact
Mm-hmm.
that a prominent lawyer from the ACLU had applauded that censorship.
Sure.
But as far as like commenting on trans issues themselves, I can count on one hand the times I remember, even on Twitter, doing it.
Okay.
So I don't think it's a critique that is, that supports very much the idea that I've had this sudden obsession with culture war
Oh
issues.
yeah.
I think my readers know I don't write about it. But
Yeah.
on that issue, for sure, there is still bigotry among trans people, but also because there's been such an elevation of trans issues.
Mm-hmm.
5 years ago, the big LGBT groups were focused on same-sex marriage, discrimination against gay men and lesbian in the workplace. And since that got resolved in favor of the LGBT movement, it's almost entirely a focus on trans issues. There's some major changes going on in society about how we think of gender,
Mm-hmm.
about who gets to do what. I
Right.
remember Martina Navratilova, who was my childhood hero. I was working on a documentary about her, who was a pioneer in women's sports. Like, one time went on Twitter and said, "Wait a minute, I don't understand. If you're a trans woman, all you have to do is say that you're a trans woman. There's no surgeries needed. There's no protocols. You get to just go and participate in sports." Like, I think, and win all the prizes of women's athletics, and then go back to being, a man. I think there's a lot of big changes the movement is succeeding in fostering. It's only natural that people are going to talk about it. There's going to be
Of
a
course.
backlash toward it. But I don't really feel like I've been very much a part of that debate at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And I never. I don't pretend that you are like that. You're a main figurehead. I would just say just to put a pin on this. I find that the biggest way and the best way to learn more about a subject or the struggles of a certain group of people is to talk to them. If you ever cover like trans people in the future, talk to someone who's trans, or that goes for anything in particular. But to move on to I guess so you use Substack, Rumble, and Colin for Colin's your
Yeah, and
podcasting.
Colin, I mean, I just started using it within like the last, 2 weeks
Okay.
or so.
I'm curious like you say that these are pretty much like viable alternatives to big tech companies like Google or no like YouTube and what what merit do you see in these platforms and how do you see them as like political solutions?
So I think the problem, all of these platforms have terms of service.
Mm-hmm.
Even Parler, which got accused of having none, actually had terms of
Uh
service
huh.
regulations.
Yeah.
For example, on Substack, you couldn't write an article advocating that Jews should be put into concentration camps, or that African Americans are, inherently biologically less intelligent, that would violate their terms of service.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at the terms of service for all of these platforms, including Facebook, Google's, YouTube, and other big platforms, you'll find that they're pretty similar in what they
Yeah.
permit and in what they prohibit. The problem has become, and I don't think this is controversial, that on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, the range of opinions one can express has dramatically shrunk, so that you people are getting banned left and right, and by left and right I mean on the
Sure.
left and right,
Yeah.
if they're questioning COVID policies, if they're questioning orthodoxies from Dr. Fauci, if they have views of the 2020 election that liberal newspapers have concluded are false and that I've never seen much evidence for, namely that there was fraud in the 2020 election. You just get banned. You get removed from the platform.
Yeah.
Twitter and Facebook famously or notoriously removed the sitting president of the United States from those platforms, causing lots of criticism from elected leaders around the world, including people who hate Trump, like Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron,
Yeah.
and President Lopez Obrador in Mexico, on the grounds that these companies have too much power. So
Sure.
what I think Substack and Rumble and Callin are designed to do is to say, we're going to have content moderation rules. We don't
Mm-hmm.
want neo-Nazis arguing that Jews should be incinerated in concentration camps,
Right.
but we're not going to exploit or expand them to basically prohibit ideologies from being expressed or from people questioning the assertions of authorities, because we don't think as tech executives we're competent to police discourse and decree what is true and false, what ideas are good and bad. So, as somebody who's a big believer in free speech and always has been, and who is someone who I viewed my work with Snowden as defending a free internet,
Yeah.
like a free and open internet, this
Yeah.
technology that would liberate us from centralized corporate. This has been a cause of mine for forever.
Right.
And so I feel like these platforms, which are designed to provide a much more permissive range of ideas to be heard,
Mm-hmm.
are important to support and fortify, so that there can be more free discourse on the internet.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I can kind of tell because I've been on each of these platforms. Not Substack or Rumble, but like on Twitter, for instance, you can get away with so much more than you can on Facebook. Facebook is basically conservative central. But the thing is, on Facebook, if you insult someone, that's an immediate like suspension. Your account gets suspended. Like for example, when it comes to Substack and Rumble, I the only reason I ask this is because I'm of the belief that you should disclose whether or not you have financial participation in them. But do you have a ownership stake in these companies by chance?
No, I don't have. I've disclosed all of that. I don't have. Substack. My deal with Substack is they don't pay me any money. I have no ownership money. I have no ownership stake at all.
Mm-hmm.
The only money I don't even get I didn't even get one of those advances that they offered to people. They talked to me at the very beginning about whether I'd be interested. I said no. I just want to get paid by my readers.
Okay.
Same with Rumble. I did disclose. I did disclose that they paid me to come there in the first instance, but after that, I have the same deal as everybody else, that I get paid like the way you do on YouTube, based on how many viewers you attract. I don't really know. I'm not really sure why journalists have an obligation to disclose their compensation.
Oh,
I mean, do you know how much people at the New York Times make? Or,
right. Yeah.
I'm not.
Of
I don't know where
course.
that comes from.
Though
Um,
I guess it ties into one of the biggest issues when it comes to politics, especially in America, and I would say this is like easily up there, like top three, like major problems. Because of the outcome of Citizens United, money basically equals free speech. And when it comes to like political campaigns, you can basically donate endless amounts of money, and it's basically what's essentially legalized bribery, and you can if money equals free speech, and you donate a certain amount of money to that campaign, when that campaign gets in office, they can do favors for you. And so my next question is, do you still support the the outcome and consequences of Citizens United?
For sure. I think, just to be clear, people have this recollection that it was this incredibly polarized issue where only people on the right supported the majority decision in Citizens United while people on the left opposed it.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, for example, the ACLU weighed in favor of the majority view of Citizens United.
Mm.
Labor unions weighed in favor of the majority view on Citizens United. Eliot Spitzer, who was at the time one of the most left-wing governors in America, taking on Wall Street, did the same. And one of the big misconceptions about Citizens United was it was a 5-4 ruling, but on the questions that make people most kind of passionate. And by the way, Citizens United was 2011, right? So to the extent people want to say I've changed my views or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
I was, I think it was 2010 actually. I was very honest at the time with my readers. I knew I had a very left-leaning readership and they wanted to know, what is your view of Citizens United? I didn't, lie and say I'm against it. I knew that my view would anger them. And that showed at the time to my readers that sometimes I'm going to tell you things that I know you don't want to hear, that you're going to be very angry about, but I'm never going to change my views in order to
Right.
keep you. I'm always going to tell you what I think. So that's why I am kind of always amazed at the idea that I'm willing to change my views for money. I mean, I quit my job at The Intercept with a huge salary,
Mm-hmm.
never knowing if I was going to get that back, on the
Right.
principle that I was not going to let people censor me. But anyway, getting back to United, the thing that people usually get most upset about is, are corporations people under the Constitution? Like,
Right.
do corporations have the right to have constitutional rights? And then, is money speech?
Mm-hmm.
And on those two questions, the vote was 9-0, not
Right.
5-4. Everybody recognizes that corporations have constitutional rights. For example,
Right.
if the U.S. Congress tomorrow said the ACLU is prohibited from expressing views critical of President Trump, of course the ACLU could go into court and say, we as an organization, as a duly formed nonprofit corporation, have the constitutional right under the First Amendment not to be restricted that way. And nobody would say, oh, it's the ACLU. You don't have constitutional rights. Only individuals do. And on the issue of money, imagine if, Congress tomorrow passed a law saying no citizens can spend money in support of messaging critical of the Republican Party. You're only allowed to spend money to support the Democratic Party. Everybody would agree that's unconstitutional, right? That's
Yeah.
clearly a First Amendment violation, even though all they're doing is restricting how money is spent.
Yeah.
The only thing, so all justices, including the 4 liberal justices in Citizens United, agreed that corporations have constitutional rights,
Mm-hmm.
and that it can be a restriction of free speech to limit how money can be spent on politics. The only question they disagreed on was, there are times when you can actually limit First Amendment rights, free speech rights, when there's a compelling interest to do so, and the state has a compelling interest to do so. The 5 judges who ruled in the majority of Citizens United said, we don't think the state has a compelling interest to limit how money can be spent on politics. The case, you might remember, grew out of a group that produced a film critical of Hillary Clinton right as she was gearing up to run for president. That was what got stopped was this law that said corporations can't spend money on politics 30 days before the election. And they said, how can you prevent us from making a film about Hillary Clinton? That's unconstitutional.
That was
The
back
5
in
judges,
2008, right?
yeah, when she was getting ready to run against, and she lost to
Yeah,
President Obama in
that's
the
right.
Democratic primary. And the 4 liberal judges, the only difference they had was they said, no, we think there is a compelling enough interest in preventing corporations from spending money on politics that in this case, we think it's justified for there to be a limitation on free speech. That was what the judges disagreed on. And
Okay.
as somebody who believes in a more expansive view of free speech like the ACLU, I ended up on the side of the majority, supporting that decision for the same reason the ACLU did. But that was back in 2010, 11 years ago.
Yeah. So would you say that today that there's nothing about the campaign finance system in the United States that you would change, and that you would be opposed to overturning Citizens United?
What I had said at the time, and what I still think, is I mean, I am utterly convinced, and I'm sure we're in agreement on this, that the ability of rich people
Uh-huh.
to essentially buy the political process using their wealth is one of the two or three biggest problems that the American political system faces,
Right.
maybe the biggest. And I
Yeah.
said that at the time. The idea that if you can afford lobbyists, you can pick up the phone and get Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell on the phone, you can have your way in Congress. It's an enormous problem.
Right.
And the founders actually warned of that. They said that
Mm-hmm.
obviously the founders weren't socialists,
Yeah.
they believed in capitalism, but they did say if you get wealth inequality severe enough, it will spill over into the political realm and it'll make the idea of political equality an illusion. So I absolutely agree that that is a huge problem. What I don't think is the solution is to restrict how people can spend money, because I do believe the that people have the right to spend their money on politics. If I want to take out a full page ad in the New York Times condemning Donald Trump, I it's my money. I should have the right to do that. I don't
Yeah.
think the government can stop me. I think the solution is public funding of campaigns.
I
So if I
agree.
run for Senate as a liberal and someone against me is a conservative, and that conservative is getting $20 million from big business, I think there should be a public fund that makes sure I can have equal footing, so
Yeah.
that big business can't, so that we're not beholden to big
Right.
corporations, big tech, Wall Street when we run for office. That's what I think the solution is.
Yeah, I definitely agree with public funding of elections. And when it comes to Citizens United basically saying that money equals free speech, just to like lay out a hypothetical, would you say that hiring a hitman, for example, is you exercising your free speech?
No, in the same way that I wouldn't say that I have the right to go publish an article if we get done here and I don't like what we've said, accusing you of being a pedophile baselessly, right? I don't have the
Right.
First Amendment right to do that.
Yeah.
I don't have the First Amendment right, if beforehand, to call you up and say, "Hey, I want you to know if you get too critical of me, I'm going to have you murdered."
Mm-hmm.
Political speech, the First Amendment protects political speech. It
Sure.
protects political opinions, political viewpoints. It has never protected defamation. It doesn't protect commercial speech.
Right.
So I can't have a fake cubic zirconia ring and
Yeah.
sell it to you for $10 million by convincing you that it's a real diamond.
I mean,
It's the idea is you can protect that you have the right to your political opinions. That's what the government can't restrict or punish.
right. Okay. Um.
Can we just get back for 1 second?
Oh,
I'm gonna
yeah.
give you all the time you want.
Sure.
I just want to get back because I'm genuinely interested in this perception, and
Uh huh.
you're definitely not the only person to share it. To the
Mm-hmm.
idea that I've become. I mean, there's this general perception that people who are in Substack in particular and who are succeeding on
Uh huh.
Substack are doing so because they're writing about hot button cultural issues, and sometimes it distorts who actually is succeeding on
Sure.
Clubhouse. I mean, on Substack, like the number one highest earner on Substack, as you might
Mm-hmm.
know, is this Boston College history professor, Heather Cox Richardson, who's basically as standard of a liberal as you can get. And every
Mm-hmm.
day she wakes up and she writes stuff about Donald Trump being a threat to democracy in a very kind of like resistance, normie liberal sort of way with a veneer of academic scholarship.
Yeah.
And she's wildly popular. There are, lots of people who write about tech and finance only. So there's a huge variety of people succeeding on Substack. But you did express that critique, at the beginning, and I'm
Yeah.
genuinely
Sure.
interested in it. Like when you say that you think I'm focusing on these culture war distractions, presumably in a way that's different than what I used to focus on, like what is it that you mean? Were you talking about the lesbian
Oh,
trans issue, or are you talking about things
mostly,
beyond
yeah.
that?
Mostly, yeah. That's more of an aside, and we basically covered that.
Okay.
But what I did want to get to this. See, like before this, I made sure like to do my diligence, and I followed you for a long time. I know about you because of Kyle Kalinske. And
Uh-huh.
yeah, I've listened to you on Crystal Kyle and Friends, and I've heard you talk to Kyle in the past as well. So I wanted to bring up this quote real quick from a talk
And
that
just
you.
for those who don't know, Kyle Kalinske is kind of a YouTube success story. He started about 10
Mm-hmm.
years ago. This kid in his basement, 21 years old, literally in his basement,
Yeah.
and he's grown into this, big phenomenon. He's
Mm-hmm.
kind of associated with the Bernie left, and
Yeah.
now co-host a show with Crystal Ball. So for those who don't know, but go ahead.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. On the channel Secular Talk.
Yep.
Uh, in 2015, Kyle Kalinske proposed at the time like a truce between progressives and new atheists, quote unquote, like Sam Harris, and you two discuss this idea, and you make a point that you say verbatim. Uh, imagine someone saying, I agree with you on so many issues. Your tax policy is fantastic. I agree with you on gay marriage and feminism, etc., etc. But I personally believe that the white race is superior, and our laws will reflect that. And you say, I'd say certain kind of disagreement is so significant that you regard that person as an adversary and not an ally,
Right.
especially when the disagreement is found in the area where that person is exerting the greatest influence, or a certain idea they have can become so pernicious that it outweighs agreement on other issues.
Yep.
So, my question for you is, how does that square with your praise for right wing populists, particularly Tucker Carlson, as brave, anti establishment, anti war, even calling him a socialist? While overlooking the ideas where the likes of Tucker exert the greatest influence, namely mainstreaming alt right talking points, particularly the Great Replacement theory.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I've actually praised Tucker before. Certainly not in the terms, those glowing terms that you just referenced. I don't think that was a quote you were reading of mine. Probably like a meant to be a paraphrase of what you think my sentiments are. I've always said in the past that my reason for going on Tucker's show is very simple, which is I would go on pretty much any show
Sure.
because I think it's an obligation that you have if you believe that you have ideas that society would benefit from hearing to go and speak to those audiences. I would go on Rachel Maddow's show tomorrow if she called, or Joy Reid's show, or Chris Hayes's. I always used to when they invited me, even when I was harsh critics of them, and I would do so tomorrow. So my going on a show doesn't signify anything other than the fact that I believe that that person has an audience that's worth talking to.
Sure.
Um, and I think I've gotten a lot of benefits from going in that show. I was able throughout 2020 to do something which was extremely important to me, which was advocate for a pardon for my source and one of my best friends in the world, Edward Snowden, as well as the person I think is one of the most important journalistic pioneers in the world, Julian Assange, was able to make that case directly to the person who had the power to pardon him. Those are not small causes. No one else was making the
Right.
cause other than Tucker's show. I think it would have been incredibly grotesquely irresponsible had I not availed myself of that opportunity.
Sure.
But as far as as far as the critiques that you voice of Tucker, I probably don't agree with a lot of them, and some of them I do, and we can talk about that. But in 2018, when I was still at the Intercept, Jeremy Scahill was the host and still is of a popular podcast called Intercepted,
Mm-hmm.
and he was going away on vacation and asked me to co-host the show and said I could have on anyone I wanted, and I invited Tucker Carlson on as my guest. And I think we talked for about 45 minutes, the first half or so of which was about Russiagate, where we had a lot of agreement.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we were both skeptics of Russiagate from the start.
Yeah.
And the entire second half of the interview, of the discussion, was nothing other than my confronting him with criticisms that are frequently voiced by others. And I told him the ones that I selected were ones that I shared about the ways in which he often talks about marginalized groups or talks about news stories in a way that is gratuitously inflammatory and can even stimulate dangerous impulses in people.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very receptive. We had the kind of conversation that you and I are having. I posted the transcript of that part of the conversation on the internet where anyone can find it on Medium so that people can see. So I had him on my show, and I was allowed to, what was essentially my show that day, and I was able to pick the topics that
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to talk about, and half the show was devoted to my critiques of him.
Okay.
what I find unfair is the idea that I'm supposed to go on his show where the way cable works is
Yeah.
someone calls you up, right? And they
Uh
say,
huh.
hey, we'd like you to come on and talk about this topic.
Sure.
And then you can either say, no, I don't want to talk about the topic. I don't know much about it. I'm not interested in it. I just don't have anything to say, which I sometimes do.
Right.
Or you say, okay, yeah, I'll come on and talk about that topic.
Okay.
Now, you could go on and just like go back on your word, right? And like pretend that you're going on to talk about the topic you've agreed to talk about, but instead just be like, hey, Tucker, I'm here to talk about like your whatever, your racism or this or that. Just like, you and I had an agreement about what we were going to talk about, a broad agreement, like your
Sure.
critiques of my journalism. But if you had come on and ignored that and started like, I don't know, attacking me for my personal life, for asking me weird questions about my husband or my kids.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
I would have felt violated. I would have
Of
felt like
course.
that's not what we agreed to. I would have cut you off.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
So all those years when I was going on CNN and MSNBC, I was a very vocal critic of CNN and MSNBC, but I wouldn't go on and just
Yeah.
gratuitously attack them. I would go on and talk about what we had agreed to talk about, and occasionally it would lead to criticisms of them, but often not.
Sure.
So
Okay.
when I go on Tucker's show, I go on to talk about the things I'm asked to go on and talk about. I'm not really sure. So is your argument that, referring to that quote, that I should regard Tucker as so far over the line of decency that regardless of how else we can interact, what benefits I can get by going on the show, that he should
Yes.
just be deemed radioactive and off
Yes.
limits?
Yes. Yes.
What's
I
your
do.
argument about that?
I, I, I do
Why is he
believe
over
that
that line?
because he regularly engages in the anti-immigrant sentiment, and regularly he has perpetuated the Great Replacement theory that through immigration and quote unquote open borders, even though we don't have open borders, that our way of life. He chooses his words very particularly. American life, i.e., white culture, is under threat by the scary brown people from over the border, from over the ocean.
That's not a quote. That's your interpretation of
That
what you
yes,
believe he's
that's
saying,
not.
right?
It's not just my interpretation either, and it's
I know, but I'm saying that's not a quote that you just attributed to him. That's your
no,
essentially.
but he has said dirty. He's called people dirty, like that's for sure, and when he does, he's usually talking about sanctuary cities, or immigrants that within the city, for example. That's what I'm talking about. That's why I argue that lending him credence by appearing him on a show and giving him credibility when he doesn't deserve it by perpetuating those abhorrent positions, I think is unconscionable, to be honest.
Yeah, no. So I'm glad you raised that. But I'm definitely going to talk about the specifics of what you understand his beliefs to be. But before I do, let me just ask you to be honest, and you seem like an honest guy, so I trust that you're going to give me the honest answer.
Sure.
Do you regularly like sit down and watch Tucker's show? Like sit down, watch the monologue, or do you generally see it when like anti GOP groups like Media Matters or Vox are circulating clips they believe are incriminating? Like, how is it that you end up getting exposed to his show?
Usually it's incriminating clips. Yeah, just to be completely honest, but that's enough to me because the fact that he's the most watched primetime political pundit, and the fact that millions of people see that every day, not just on Twitter, not just on YouTube, but people that actually have cable and regularly watch Tucker. That to me is enough to where he. To where I hold those positions against him.
Yeah, that's fair. Like, so the reason I ask that is because I just know this from personal experience. If there is somebody who wants to disparage me or cast me in a bad light, and there are definitely people who
Sure.
devote a lot of time to doing that,
Hmm.
they're probably going to be able to take clips of this particular conversation
Yeah.
and just kind of take these snippets out of the context in which they took place and create an impression of what our conversation was or what I said that would be much, much different if you actually sat and listened to the conversation from start to finish
Sure.
and understood the full context.
Yeah.
So that's the first point I would make, is that the
Yeah.
people who watch Tucker's show and hear what he says night to night,
Mm-hmm.
so often, what Media Matters does, what they're funded to do, right? They're never there to take the clips that make Tucker look good or reasonable or compassionate or humanitarian. They pick the quotes on
Sure.
the segments on purpose, and they clip them on purpose and frame them on purpose
Mm-hmm.
to get you angry, to make you feel like he's a terrible person. That's the organizational mission of Media Matters and Fox, which doesn't mean that what you're seeing is completely false. I'm just saying it's important, I think, to realize that there is a difference between the message you get if you're getting clips of his chosen by people who dislike him and are purposely trying to disparage him, versus the relationship that he has with his viewers who watch him every night and hear his full message. That's the first thing.
Sure.
So on the specifics of like the Great Replacement theory and the anti-immigration stuff, let me just say a few things. Because by appearing on, I don't watch Fox News. I don't watch any cable shows.
Sure.
In part because I live in Brazil. I don't even think it's available. I think I could probably find a way to stream it online if I wanted to, but I don't.
Sure.
But by appearing as much as I do on Fox, you get there 15 minutes early. You hear it in your earpiece. So I hear the show a lot of times from the start. Often, I'm on the show once or twice a week.
Yeah.
Things like that. So I feel like I have a good sense for the discourse he's engaging in. First of all, it is interesting, the whole question of immigration, which is that, when I started writing about politics in 2005, the idea of open borders was most vehemently opposed by the left. It was the left that hated open borders. You can go back when George Bush and Dick Cheney were advocating what they were calling immigration reform. The argument from the left, I'm talking about like the real left, like Bernie Sanders, Sherrod Brown, labor union leaders, like Cesar Chavez, was that open borders was a Koch brothers Chamber of Commerce plot to flood the nation with surplus labor in order to bring down wages and hurt the American worker.
Yeah.
And you can even go back to 2013, so like in the Obama years, when Jamil Bowie, who now writes for the New York Times, was at the American Prospect, and he has an article, and you can Google it, called African American Skepticism on Immigration, and his argument was, if you cannot turn the Democratic Party into an open borders party, because African Americans know that the people who are going to be hurt most by increasing immigration are them.
Right.
That it's their jobs that are going to first be given to new arrivals, that their wages are going to suffer, and they've always been. So the whole idea of how immigration is thought about, which is that the left used to always be opposed to it, and now to be opposed to immigration almost is proof that you're like a white nationalist or racist. Like you can't possibly be in favor of immigration restriction except because you hate the people coming in or believe they're inferior, is a very new way of understanding politics. And even when Bernie ran in 2016, he sat down with Ezra Klein, who was at Fox, and Ezra asked him, "Are you in favor of open borders?" And he looked at Ezra like he was crazy and said, "Open borders? Are you kidding? That's a Koch brothers plot."
Yeah.
That's what Bernie said.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing, is being concerned about open borders or the unrestrained flow of people across the border has always been popular on the left. Like the concern about that is the American worker, and it's never been viewed as kind of like an inherently racist position. Obviously it can be racist, but it's not inherently. So and then the point of that, and so I, just to be clear, I have never ever heard Tucker frame immigration or any other issue in the racist terms that you attributed to him. In fact, he believes that what is racist is liberal discourse, the idea that we should judge people based on their race. His central moral principle, he says, and he says it all the time, like continuously, is that we ought to be a race-blind society, that we should never judge a human being based on immutable characteristics, the color of their skin, things they can't control. That, like, so fundamental to the conception of justice is the idea that individuals should be treated without regard to race. And
Yeah.
whenever he talks about, for example, immigration, he makes that same argument that Jamil Bowie makes, that if you have people flooding across the border in an uncontrolled way, the people who are going to be hurt by that are not wealthy elites
Yeah.
who wall themselves off in their communities, have gated streets, who send their kids to private school.
Right.
It falls on the working class,
Mm-hmm.
who is not white people, but
Yeah.
is a multiracial group of American citizens, all of whom are equal. That's what his real argument is explicitly. Now, you can say there's more sinister subtext, but I just want to be clear that on the level of what he says, it's aggressively race neutral. And then let me just tell you about something about the replacement theory. I'll just give you an analogy that
Sure.
probably a lot of right wing listeners are not going to love, but this is something I noticed a long time ago. I think I wrote about it once in Salon in 2007, 2008.
Mm-hmm.
If you are in the left and you say that you believe that American Jewish voters cast their votes based on what is best, not for the United States, but for Israel, you will be immediately labeled an anti-Semite. You'll be accused of propagating a long-standing anti-Semitic trope that Jews have dual loyalty, that they're
Mm-hmm.
not real Americans or real Germans or real British
Yeah.
or real French, that they always have loyalty to Israel. That's their
Sure.
first loyalty.
Yeah.
But what used to drive me crazy is that a lot of Republican neocons, like Bill Kristol in the Weekly Standard in 2007 and 2008, would write articles
Mm-hmm.
overtly arguing that no American Jews should in good conscience vote for the Democratic Party because
Mm-hmm.
of how critical they are for Israel, that Republicans are much more supportive of Israel, and therefore American Jews have the obligation to vote for the party that's best for Israel, which is the Republican Party. Obviously, the
Terrible.
premise of that argument,
Uh-huh.
when made from the right, which is
Mm-hmm.
so totally acceptable, is exactly the same as the one that's prohibited when made from the left, namely that American Jews cast their votes based on what's best for this foreign country. This is the same double standard I'm seeing with the idea of the great replacement theory. When Tucker first talked about the idea that bringing immigrants from certain countries in changed the political character
Right.
and cultural character of the country, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, was called for his firing.
Yeah.
And he immediately pointed out, and it's true, you can go on the ADL website and read it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
The ADL formally is opposed to both the one-state solution for Israelis and Palestinians,
Mm-hmm.
as well as giving Palestinians the right of return. The idea that Palestinians who are displaced from their land should get to come back and have full voting rights. Because their argument is that if you allow Palestinian citizenship, it
Mm-hmm.
will change the character of Israel. It'll mean Israel is no longer a Jewish state. It'll destroy the character of Israel.
Right.
Exactly the same premise as what people call the Great Replacement Theory, that if you import enough people into a country and make them citizens with voting rights, it
Yeah.
changes the character of the country. But
Yeah.
it's not just the ADL. It's not just the ADLU. It's the Democratic Party. You can find Democratic Party leaders who frequently say, as if it's a good thing, which for them it is,
Uh-huh.
hey, look, because of immigration, demographic changes are happening that are going to mean that in 10 to 20 years, we're going to get to win states like Texas and Arizona
Sure.
because we're changing the nature of the voting population through immigration. So when Tucker says bringing in new people changes the nature of a country's political and cultural identity, he's making the same arguments that the Democratic Party and the ADL make, just from the other side.
Sure.
And I'm not really sure why one is permissible and one isn't.
I think that the thing is, he's when he says it, what his base here is, oh, well, foreigners are going to come in and take over the country, and we're no longer going to be a free capitalist country with liberty, and it's going to be filled with all these woke immigrants, and I guess the biggest thing is like when he Yeah, that's basically it. What he perpetuates is like it's what his audience hears, is what his base hears, because like the big one of the biggest issues when it comes to the discourse is that we all perceive what someone says entirely differently, and so when because you saw examples when Tucker was perpetuating these talking points about foreigners coming in and taking American jobs. Uh, his his audience, people interviewed them or they saw like comments on videos and whatnot, and it basically reflects exactly the sentiment that white nationalists have said with the Great Replacement, and that there's this central plot, um, like the Jewish question, to replace white people and basically incorporate what is essentially the white genocide, according to them. Um,
But
and to be
do you think Tucker favors the deportation or
yes,
citizenship of Black and Hispanic Americans?
if I mean I couldn't say
Like,
for
has he ever advocated that or said anything remotely close to that? That he, like, 13% of the population are Black Americans. Another, I don't know what the exact number is, they call it 15, 20%
hmm
are Hispanics, could be even higher.
yeah.
Have you ever heard him saying we need to deport them or strip them of their citizenship so that we can have a white nationalist country?
No, that's the thing too. It's all about how you frame your arguments. It's all about the language that you use. Because if you,
But have you heard him say anything that would even
I don't
hint
have an
that he
example.
supports that?
No,
I
I
mean,
don't have an
but that's
example.
kind of, but that's kind of important, right? Because, like,
hmm
the idea that if that immigrants will take people's jobs,
hmm
it's a fact. I mean, immigrants do come in and lower wages for the American worker, and
Mm,
that, as I said, is a longstanding concern on the part of labor unions and the American left,
sure.
and also the American right. And when you say, I'm concerned that new people are going to come in and take away jobs from Americans and lower their wages, what you're talking about, again, is not rich Americans.
hmm
You know, they don't come in and steal jobs from, like, physicists and
Yeah.
cable hosts and
Well,
journalists. They what you're talking about is the working class, which is largely a multiracial working class. Like, when you're defending the working class and their wages and their jobs, you're
well,
defending huge numbers of Black and Hispanic Americans along with white working
mhm.
class
Well,
Americans.
overall, I do believe that immigration is a good thing because, like it or not, the reality is that there are a lot of jobs, especially within the agricultural sector, that are low, like they're so low paying that they're usually taken by migrants or immigrants, and they're just paid under the table, and
But do you
that's
think
just
that's good, or I mean, isn't it better to just have better enforcement of, to make these companies pay decent living wages so that Americans will
I
be
can
able to take those jobs?
Sure, I completely agree, but I don't think that like either way, the immigration reform is completely needed. I'm not going to pretend to be like an expert. I'm just some political nerd, honestly. But overall, yes, like a wage increase and a limit on the outsourcing of jobs, I believe is crucial for a stronger working class. But I don't believe in like closing off the border, and I don't believe I vehemently opposed Trump's policies, and I oppose Biden's policies at the border right now. I think it's too rigid, and the fear, there's just a lot of fear mongering on the conservative right that is mucking up discourse. Some even claiming that we have open borders right now, and that which is completely ridiculous.
But let
Um,
me ask you about that, because this is
sure.
actually something I'm very interested in. So, you made your case against Tucker, and
hmm
I think a lot of people share your views. I said what I understand him to be arguing, and why
Right.
for me he's not sober the line that, like, he's some kind of, like, untouchable.
Yeah.
And by the way, I also don't think that by going on his show, I'm doing him a favor. Like, I think his show would thrive without
Sure.
me.
Yeah,
There
of
was like a
course.
year when I didn't go on because I was so occupied with my Brazil exposés in like
Yeah.
2019 and 2020. He did just fine without me. Like, I feel like I use his platform more
Yeah.
than I give it something. I don't like. I think he's gonna thrive with whether I go on or not.
Yeah.
But like what you were just saying is true, right? Like that we don't have open borders. Biden's
Hmm.
immigration policies are very, very similar to Trump's in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Obama deported more Americans or more people from the United States in his 8 years than any president before or since, including Donald Trump. And then, I presume that even though you have a lot of criticisms
Sure.
of CNN hosts like Wolf Blitzer and Anderson Cooper
Yeah.
or Chris Cuomo,
Right.
and a lot of criticisms of MSNBC hosts like Joe Scarborough or Rachel Maddow,
Yeah.
that you would not say they're off limits. So, like, if I were to go on their show, you would say, look, I have criticisms of them, but I at least think they're within the realm of decency sufficient to make it acceptable for you to go on their shows, right?
I think there is somewhat of a case to be made there. And honestly, like I mean, we could sit here all day and talk about Tucker Carlson, but in the end, there's obviously limitations because there's a lot that I haven't seen from him. But like I said before, there's enough that I've seen from him to where I wouldn't consider him a decent person as you would because of the rhetoric that he's espoused.
Do you
Um,
consider like Rachel Maddow and Chris Cuomo decent people?
I I don't know. Like just like you, I don't really watch a lot of mainstream media. They've said dumb things in the past because they
And
peddle
like
talk.
supported wars,
Yes,
right? And like
exactly. Yeah, they peddled talking points for the establishment and fear mongered about Russia this and Russia that, and yeah, like cheered on the war machine. One of the most disgusting things I saw was during one of the debates. It was one of the final debates of the Democratic primary when on I think MSNBC was hosting it, and Chuck Todd basically asked the remaining Democratic contenders if uh, if there was a like if someone got a plurality of the vote, if I forget the way it was phrased, but if the remaining moderates would um, I I'm probably completely butchering this, but they would basically get all their votes together to make sure that one candidate rises ahead instead of Bernie Sanders, basically like foregoing the actual process. Like say if Bernie actually got the plurality, but the rest of the candidates got less than him, but enough to if combined. uh, would actually be more than Bernie. The way it was phrased
right, they
was
were
disgust.
obsessed with making sure Bernie didn't get the nomination,
Exactly.
basically saying they would cheat in order to do it.
And apparently MSNBC cut that question and their answers out of their playback for the stream that they did of that entire debate, and I found that to just be abhorrent. So yeah, I have no respect for any of the hosts on MSNBC or CNN. I guess the only one that I find to be pretty good actually would be Mehdi Hassan on I think it's Peacock or something like that. I think he's pretty good.
Yeah, he was actually he was the person I recruited to come to The Intercept. I
Cool.
recruited him very actively to promote him when he was at Al Jazeera. I have a lot of difference with him now, but let me
Nice.
just
Yeah,
let me just
I
say that.
digress.
Yeah, no, well, so let me just talk for one because we're coming up on about an hour, which I think is a
Yeah.
decent amount of time. I think it's
Sure.
been a really good
Yeah.
conversation that has covered a lot of topics. But I just want to
Yeah.
talk a little bit more, just like out of one or two more points about my relationship with Fox,
Sure.
since that is one of the obviously biggest critiques.
Yeah. Sure.
And I guess I should first of all let me just say that I didn't just start going on Fox within the last 2 or 3 years. When I was doing the Snowden reporting, for example, I went on almost every Fox show to talk about the Snowden reporting. There was a lot of support for the Snowden reporting on the right,
Yeah.
but there was also a lot of criticism. And I would go on and I would, have a lot of kind of adversarial interviews, just like I would on NBC and CNN, but it isn't like I just woke up a couple of years ago and decided I'm going to start going on Fox. I
Yeah.
always went on Fox,
Sure.
even way back when I was, beloved by tons of leftists, based on the same principle, which hasn't changed, that if you're going to thrust yourself into the public platform as a journalist, you should be held accountable for the things you say, and you
Yeah.
should, answer questions. Same reason why I wanted to have you on.
Yeah.
But let me just say this, which is, if you look at what has happened over the last 5 years since basically Trump came down the escalator and
Mm-hmm.
got the Republican nomination and then became president, the I would say that there are two major issues that dominated the political landscape, at least in terms of what I focused on. One was Russiagate, right? Which I know people want to forget, and I know a lot of people on the left never really cared about, so they don't really fully acknowledge that it was the dominant topic swamping our political discourse for at least 3 years. The
Mm-hmm.
idea that there had been something nefarious, criminal, conspiracy between the Kremlin and Trump, and that there were
Mm-hmm.
all these Kremlin agents running around the government, and that Putin had seized control of the United States through blackmail, like the kind of stuff out of the 1950s that the CIA used to peddle about the Kremlin.
Yeah.
That was one major issue. And
Mm-hmm.
then the other major debate was the fact that, as we kind of alluded to earlier, there's been this significantly increased repression, as I see it, this reduction in the range of permissible views permitted on the internet as a result of more censorship on the part of Facebook,
Right.
uh, Google, and Twitter. And 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 I guess that you could just add on, like, in terms of what for me has been the most important, was the cause of getting a pardon for both Snowden and Assange, which we came
Mm-hmm.
a lot closer to doing than most people realized.
Yeah.
So if you look at those three issues, Russiagate, free speech, a pardon for Assange and Snowden, the simple reality is that I actually do think that Fox did a much, much, much better job of reporting on those issues
Sure.
than those other outlets. I think Fox got
Yeah.
Russiagate right, and NBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN got it completely wrong.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to online censorship, Fox's defense of free speech, even if it's selfishly motivated,
Uh-huh.
is the correct one, and I think the view of the other outlets is wrong. I obviously found very valuable the opportunity, which I only had on Fox,
Mm-hmm.
to repeatedly go on and make the case for a pardon of Snowden and Assange.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that it's surprising that I found myself in alignment with Fox on these key issues. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this is what I can tell you.
Uh-huh.
I am 100% positive that if there's some major news event that takes place where I have a different view than a lot of people at Fox, they will continue to invite me on.
Yeah, of
But the
course.
reality is, the reason I don't go on MSNBC or CNN anymore and haven't been on since late 2016 is because they stopped inviting me on and anybody else on who was a cynic or a skeptic of Russiagate.
Sure.
So, in a lot of ways, Fox became the only outlet I had on
Uh-huh.
TV to talk about the issues that I think mattered. So my choices weren't go on CNN and MSNBC or go on Fox. My choices were go on Fox or just accept the fact that Wolf Blitzer and Rachel Maddow have decided that you don't belong on TV, and
Sure.
meekly obeyed that decree by staying off television. And I just don't see why I should accept the decree of people like Rachel Maddow and Wolf Blitzer, that until they decide that I'm to be heard from, I'm to sit in the corner and be quiet. That's what really explains my last 3 or 4 years of my relationship with Fox.
Right. Yeah. Just to briefly touch on those a bit regarding Russia, I do believe there were a series of convictions of people as in Trump's inner circle and his administration as a result of the Russia investigation. That's
Right,
one.
for lying to investigators, not for
Right.
criminally conspiring with
And
Russia.
either way, Trump did actually have more of a friendly stance with Russia, and one big big example was the ending of the I think it was the Intermediate Missile Treaty or something along some sort of nuclear treaty that had been in place since 1987 that basically like kept Russia at bay when it came to it was either nuclear arms or intermediate missiles, something along those lines. And there was no precedent for it. Trump just it was literally just a gift to Putin. But that's one example. And also when it comes to censorship, I do you believe that there is a disinformation problem on the internet when it comes to the election and vaccine hesitancy and skepticism? I guess you could say.
Yeah, I think there's some problem wherever you have free speech. There's going to be people spreading ideas that aren't true.
Yeah.
I think there's a disinformation problem when it comes to COVID. I think there's a disinformation problem when it comes to our elections. I think there's a big disinformation problem when it comes to
Right.
almost every
So
issue. And oftentimes it comes from the establishment corporate outlets, not from, kind of like QAnon or Facebook boomers. And I think the solution to disinformation is more free speech, not having Facebook and Google police our discourse.
okay, well, earlier you disagreed that hiring a hitman, which is literally intended to harm people, that's not free speech. Obviously not. But when it comes to spreading information that people fall for and they end up hurting themselves because the information they're getting is faulty, like unscientifically based, and ends up like with people believing in things that ultimately harm themselves or others, uh, it you still believe that disinformation that leads to
Who
harm.
do you trust? Who do you trust when it so let's say we're talking about debates about booster shots or
Mm-hmm.
vaccines or whether masks are effective, cloth
Mm-hmm.
masks. Who do
Sure.
you trust? Which institutions do you trust to decree what is true and what is false to the point that you can no longer challenge their conclusions?
Well, it's not so much as who, it's about what. I think if the data from the studies from various publicly funded institutions, be it whatever. I don't have any like examples of specific institutions, but if the data collected in various databases around the world from scientists that are collaborating and sharing data and sharing studies, if the data is so conclusive to the point where it's
But who
basically
decides that? Who decides it's so conclusive?
the
Like it's crossed the
it's
line from debatable to non-debatable.
it's not I don't think it's about who. I think it's about the data that's collected and what the results, what the conclusions of that data that's collected
Well, I'll give you
shows.
an example. I'll give you an example. Like in March and April of 2020, so just like a year and a half ago,
Mm-hmm.
the overwhelming consensus of the scientific community that came from Dr. Fauci, the World Health
Mm-hmm.
Organization, scholars, and epidemiologists was that given what we knew about the novel coronavirus,
Mm-hmm.
wearing a mask if you didn't have symptoms was not just unnecessary, but actually ill advised, like dangerous, because you could trap the virus into your nose and mouth and circulate it even more so in your system and increase your viral load. So if you had gone on to YouTube in March or April of 2020 and told people you believe they should use masks, you would have been contravening the consensus of advice from all of these establishment scientific institutions. Do you think in March and April, people who did that should have been censored from the internet on the grounds that the evidence was conclusive that masks were unnecessary or harmful?
Um, I I don't know much about that. I don't know if censoring them would be um, necessary. But just to take that at face value, though, I think the biggest reason why masks were so widely pushed was to prevent spread to other people. So if you catch it and you're for some reason you're out in public and you're wearing a mask, um, if it increases your viral load but it doesn't spread to other people,
No, but
that
the guidance from the World Health Organization and Fauci were don't use masks.
I I it's been so long. Like
Yeah,
that was such a hectic time. I was just worried about like where my toilet paper was going to come from.
yeah. No, look. So let me just say, like, we could go on forever.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
really have enjoyed talking to
Of
you
course.
in large
Yeah.
part because I think you've been a very honest, civil, but persistent
Sure. Yeah.
adversary. Like you've stuck to your guns, but at the same time, I think it's been, we've heard each other out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think it's been very helpful. I think like a lot of the critiques that you have of me, you're definitely not alone. They're ones that I hear every day.
Sure.
I try to be humble in the sense that like I try not to be defensive and instantly, deny the
Yeah.
validity of every critique that is brought to me. At the same time, and especially if someone comes and says, hey, like I've been a big fan of yours, I've admired your work for 10 years, I'm really disappointed in the things that you're doing now, I'm going to listen to a person like that.
Yeah.
But like ultimately I feel like what has always made me somebody who people have wanted to listen to and to trust is the fact that I follow my own conscience and
Mm-hmm.
not the path that is going to make me most popular.
Yeah.
And all I can promise you is that calculus hasn't changed. Like maybe I'm taking positions that aren't the correct ones. Maybe I'm making choices that aren't the best ones, but my metric for deciding,
Mm-hmm.
which is how do I think I'm staying truest to myself and my own views, and how am I contributing the most valuable to society, that really hasn't changed at all.
Sure. Okay. I guess the last thing I've been meaning to touch on this the whole time, but one of the biggest things that I think rubbed a lot of people the wrong way was when I think you were on a Daily Caller show, and you said that you considered Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon, and the 2016 iteration of Trump to
Right.
be socialists.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly did you mean by that?
Yeah, so just I've gone on a lot of shows and
Yeah.
talked a lot about this. So just, people can go watch. I'll just give you the very quick summary, which is the point I was making was that socialism used to have a very dogmatic meaning. There used to be books written about what is socialism,
Mm-hmm.
and all the things that it entailed. And all I was really saying was that the mainstream political figures who now use that term to describe themselves, people like AOC or Bernie, kind of
Mm-hmm.
squad politics,
Yeah.
aren't really talking about the extreme version of socialism, the kind of dogmatic
Yeah.
revolutionary socialism.
I
They're
personally don't
talking
consider
about
them
something that,
socialists.
yeah, they're talking about like a reformist incremental socialism that's
Sure.
really designed to give a little more benefits to workers, to people who are suffering economically, and to combat corporate control, corporatism, the values of corporatism.
Yeah.
And the point I was making was that one of the reason right-wing movements are succeeding in France and Europe generally, here in Brazil with Bolsonaro, with Brexit, and with
Mm-hmm.
Trump, is because the right has commandeered a lot of that, not just rhetoric, but policymaking. Like Josh Hawley is the one who sat on the floor with Bernie Sanders to block the COVID relief bill until it included direct payments to citizens, and then Trump vetoed it after the election on the grounds that
Yeah.
the payment wasn't high enough, on the grounds that it's time that we stop creating government for big corporations and do more for the common person. And
Yeah.
all I was saying was, by the definition of socialism that it has taken on in its colloquial sense, you could actually make the case that Steve Bannon and the way that Trump ran in 2016 and Tucker Carlson are that. When
Sure.
Andrew Cuomo wanted to give tax breaks to Amazon, AOC stood up and said it's outrageous to give tax breaks to the world's richest corporation. And that night, Tucker Carlson went on and did a 10-minute segment on how AOC was right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was just trying to get people to see that there is a right-wing populism, and economic populism that in a loose-fitting way can be put under the rubric of socialism as it's defined in its colloquial sense. That was the only point I was making.
Sure. So here's my issue with all of that. In my opinion, vaguely gesturing to the plight of the working class, to me, is not socialism. I don't consider AOC or Bernie to be socialists, just like I don't even remotely consider Tucker Carlson or 2016 iteration of Donald Trump to be a socialist. I mostly find right wing populism, for example, to be largely fraudulent, and they only like you said they use a lot of this rhetoric to garner support, because when people, for example, the working class hear, oh well, I'm going to make the economy better for you. I'm going to make things better for workers and for labor, etc. I think Josh Hawley is a terrible example because he voted against the minimum wage increase. So I just he's another example of a fraudulent right wing populist. I think it's like what I said earlier about a quote from the your conversation with Kyle Klinsky. If you hold like contradicting positions that are like, okay, for example, the whole notion of wokeness and how there are people that convince you that the only way to achieve class liberation is to give up on social rights and fighting for racial and social justice, and to stop fighting on behalf of the marginalized, because it's seen as you being woke. The moment that fight ends, the fascist right wins because you are thereby catering to them, who see anything woke as degenerate, and they live to see the destruction of that. And that's also known as class reductionism. There's a big when it comes to like the culture war. All the right does is like you've probably seen it on Twitter, like going off about Big Bird getting a vaccine, or trans people being included in kids shows, and just representation for the marginalized. The conservative right in this country, especially, see that as a giant threat, and they use that to distract their conservative bases, their conservative audiences. And even though the Republican Party, for example, are terrible economically, they're far worse for the working class than I would say the Democrats are. Though, because their base is so scared because of the scary culture war issues, wokeness, etc., they'll still vote for the Republican Party because they think that it's the only way to protect like themselves from the evil communists and protect their children because they were tricked into voting against their own interests.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot there, and I think we should come to an end just
Yeah,
so we
of
don't
course,
have
yeah,
a ton
we
of
can
time
leave
left.
on
But let
this.
me just
Yeah.
say, the fact that like just a couple things is like the fact that you don't think AOC and Bernie are socialists was really my point, right? Which
Uh huh.
is obviously like if you had to pick anyone in mainstream politics
Yeah,
who could qualify as a socialist, you would
they would
have
be
to
the
pick AOC
closest.
and Bernie. There's no one really
They,
to the left of
they,
them.
yeah,
So what all I was saying was exactly your point, which is like in the traditional sense of socialism, they don't qualify. They believe in capitalism,
sure.
but by the definition of socialism that gets used for them, I think it extends to a lot more people.
Yeah, I do
I
think
do
Bernie's
agree.
probably
And
secretly.
I do agree. Do agree that Republican politicians are often fraudulent. One of the leading examples that we began with was I criticized very harshly Jim Jordan for going
Uh
on and waving this populist flag, let's break up big tech. And then when it comes time to use his position in Congress, he
right.
follows what his donors want and
Mm-hmm.
he impedes it. So it's a lot of
That's right.
deceitful rhetoric where he's deceiving his base, but doesn't really follow through. I also think Democrats do that constantly. They
Mm-hmm.
pretend to be much more, they use culture war issues all the time, talking about kids in cages. You don't hear about kids in
Yeah.
cages anymore, even though there are still kids in cages.
Right.
To me, that is politics.
Yeah.
So I don't, you're absolutely right that there's huge numbers of Republican politicians who are frauds,
Sure.
and who don't follow through on their rhetoric. I say that a lot, as I
Mm-hmm.
say it about Democrats, and I don't think much of my audience would disagree. I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times my audience seems to be angrier with the Republican Party than the Democratic Party.
I would hope
And
so.
the wokeness issue is, I don't think we should delve into that. It's a complicated topic. It could probably be its
Sure.
own standalone issue.
Sure.
But I am someone who does worry about the capacity for political rhetoric to divide us
Of course.
more than unite us, and that's something that I worry about most. But anyway, Stephen, listen.
Yeah.
Let me thank you again
Of course.
for coming on and for taking your time on Saturday to talk to me. I would love to, if you feel like it'd be worth it, to invite you back on at some point in the near future. If you have
Yeah.
other critiques and criticisms, that we can explore them.
Sure.
I don't consider anybody a somebody or nobody. I think everybody is a somebody. I think your ideas are a lot better stated and better thought through than half the people who are paid to write and talk about politics professionally. So I enjoyed talking to you, and I enjoyed
Sure.
your stepping up and backing up your critiques by coming on and talking to me. And I hope you have
Yeah.
a
No,
good afternoon.
yeah,
It was good.
absolutely. Yeah, no, I once again, I really appreciate this. It's kind of hard for me to believe. Like, I was telling my brother who lives with me, I'm talking to a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist today, and he was like, What? Well, how old is he?" And I was like, "Oh, he's like in his late 30s."
All right, thank you. That's the best thing you
Well,
could possibly have said to me, and it's the best
I
note we
had,
can end on.
I had, yeah, I honestly had no idea, but yeah, thank you once again, and I would absolutely love to come back. Thank you again for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you for doing it. It was great talking to you, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Absolutely, have a good day.
Okay.